As the U.S. and Israel's unprovoked war on Iran enters its 25th day, President Trump is claiming that Iran has begun negotiations with the United States. But the Iranian government has dismissed the claim as fake news, accusing Trump of trying to manipulate financial and oil markets. Over the weekend, Trump threatened to, quote, obliterate Iranian power plants if Iran did not fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz by Monday night. But on Monday, Trump reversed course, extended his deadline to 5 days, and repeatedly claimed the U.S. was now in productive conversations with Iran.
With Iran, we've been negotiating for a long time, and this time they mean business. And it's only because of the great job that our military did is the reason they mean business. They want to settle, and we're going to get it done, and I hope.
Earlier in the day, President Trump claimed he might personally take joint control of the Strait of Hormuz with Iran's next Ayatollah.
Be jointly controlled.
By who?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be
Me and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is, whoever the next Ayatollah. Look, and there'll also be a form of a very serious form of a regime change. Now, in all fairness, everybody's been killed from the regime. They're really starting off. There's automatically a regime change. But we're dealing with some people that I find to be very reasonable, very solid. The people within know who they are. They're very respected. And maybe one of them will be exactly what we're looking for. Look at Venezuela, how well that's working out. We are doing so well in Venezuela with oil and with the relationship between the president-elect and us. And maybe we find somebody like that in Iran.
Despite Trump's claims of U.S.-Iran negotiations, U.S. Central Command says U.S. forces, quote, continue to aggressively strike, unquote, Iran. Meanwhile, Iran's retaliated by striking other Gulf nations and Israel. Israeli officials said Iran has launched 7 missile barrages since midnight, targeting Tel Aviv and other cities. The Israeli military said one of the missiles that hit Tel Aviv carried a 220-pound warhead. Israel's health ministry said nearly 4,800 people have been injured by Iran's attacks on Israel since the war began. We go now to London, where we're joined by Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project, former Israeli peace negotiator under Israeli Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin. His recent piece for Zeteo is headlined, Why Netanyahu Duped Trump into the Illegal War with Iran. Well, Daniel Levy, thanks so much for being with us again. Why don't you explain that headline?
Well, good to be with you, Amy and Juan. Netanyahu himself and other Israeli leaders, although he's been at the helm for much of the last 3 decades, have, during an awfully long period, told us Iran is at the precipice of becoming a nuclear power. By the way, we should always remind ourselves Israel is the only nuclear-armed state in the region. But they've been telling us it's imminent, we have to act now. And they've been trying to pull successive American presidents into that war, to launch such a military campaign. They've never succeeded. You have had American presidents across the decades from whichever party has been in power who have created an extremely indulgent, permissive environment for Israel in the region, and in particular when it comes to Israel's consistent war crimes against the Palestinians. What you have not had is a president who could be led into this kind of a military operation, and we're seeing right now, in almost the last month of this war, precisely why. But this president is made of different stuff, less serious stuff, apparently, and Netanyahu saw his opportunity. But the reason, I think, why this was of such significance for Netanyahu is we are in a new era. It's not an era of a Pax Americana with, alongside all that indulgence of Israel, there were still certain brake mechanisms. This time, Israel sees us in an era of what I would call a Pax Greater Israel. This is about how far Israel can extend its dominion, how much of a hard power, dominant hegemon
It can be in the region, seizing parts of Syria or of Lebanon, trying to finish an eradicationist approach to the Palestinians, and crucially, to do that, you have to weaken Iran militarily to remove some kind of deterrent. You can only do that with the US, so you need to pull the US into this war. If that means further accelerating American decline and even accelerating Israel's loss of support in America, then it's a price to pay. It's kind of use it or lose it, because those things are happening anyway. In saying all of this, I don't want to suggest that America has no agency in this. There are things to do with the Trump administration, the neocons, the people who still have positions of influence in the US that have brought them into this. But that's what Netanyahu is trying to achieve greater Israel, domination in the region, including the weakening of the Gulf, which is intentional, at the expense of America bleeding further reputational, political, economic assets in this war.
And Daniel Levy, you've also written that, quote, the idea that this is a war to serve American rather than Israeli interests resonates primarily in three spaces: the gullible, the true believers, especially of end of times religious thinking, or those who are paid up members of Israel's echo chamber. Could you elaborate?
Yes, I think there is a lot of attention being paid to this question of who does this serve. Now, you can make the case that you also have a US government that is locked into its own kind of logic of war. You have, if I may suggest, a decline anxiety in the US. You have an attempt to reassert primacy and preponderance. I don't think that is or can go well. You have Marco Rubio, for instance, telling the Europeans, join us in the next Western century of imperial domination. That can perhaps play out in the Western Hemisphere. The crime committed with the kidnapping of a leader in Venezuela, the illegal blockade on Cuba. But if you travel too far afield to find monsters to slay, and if you have an incoherent strategy and an incompetent administration implementing that strategy, then things are going to go very badly wrong, which was entirely predictable in this illegal war of choice launched by the US and Israel. And therefore, if you look at this, and even if you factor in the attempt to assert American interest, this war would not have happened if Israel's leader had not been there, whispering in the president's ear, making the case, 7 bilateral meetings in the first 13 months of the second Trump term between Trump and Netanyahu, 2 meetings in the 8 weeks leading up to the launching of this illegal war, daily phone calls, we are told, now information coming out in the New York Times that the Mossad apparently bamboozled Americans with idea that if you could decapitate some of the regime leadership, the Mossad could foment a coup on the streets, that you could arm Kurdish groups from the outside to take geographical parts of Iran to start dismantling the central state. You really have to be, therefore, either extremely gullible, as I suggested, or a true believer that, well, this is high risk, but it's worth it because maybe you're ideologically committed to the greater Israel cause. Maybe that comes from a place of evangelical dispensationalist belief in the end times, or you simply are part of an echo chamber whose wheels are greased very consistently. And we see that play out over so many years in American politics. That's what I'm suggesting. And I do think that the attempt to suggest this is more than Israel first, that somehow this serves America's interest, are not going to go well, and Israel will pay a tremendous price for that over time.
I wanted to ask you also, there appears to have been a shift in the last few days in how the Israeli government permits damage within Israel from Iranian attacks to be publicized by the press. Because clearly during the first 2 weeks of the war, Israel essentially prevented any kind of images from the U.S. media, especially going out to the world. Now, in the last few days, it's almost as if Netanyahu and the government want their own people and the rest of the world to see some of this damage. Wondering your thoughts about this. Has there been a change in approach or tactics by the Israeli government?
So I'm not so sure. I think it's an interesting question to dwell upon. But what one might be seeing is an inability and therefore a degradation of credibility if Israel tries to claim that none of this destruction is happening. In other words, an inability to prevent those images from coming out when those strikes are now causing very significant damage. I don't want to exaggerate that either. I don't think that is what causes this unnecessary war to come to an end. But what one perhaps has to look to is if you remember early on in the war, one of the real questions, as this became a war of endurance, almost a war of attrition, was could the US and Israeli side sufficiently deplete Iran's missile launching capacity before Iran both sufficiently degraded the interception capacity on the Israeli and US side, so they have to be a bit more selective in terms of what they use the interceptors for, because they can't take everything out and they are going to run out. And also Iran apparently holding back some of its heavier kit because in its strategy, it assumed this could go on for a long time and it had to have a plan for week 1, week 2, week 3. And so I think to the extent to which we're seeing more images, it is likely because that equation hasn't played well for the US and Israel, and because we're seeing more damage being done. I think you have a war where Israel has a strategy. It's an extremely ambitious overreach strategy in terms of not regime change, but regime collapse, state collapse, implosion, the dismantling of the Iranian state, where Iran has a strategy of escalating horizontally, testing American endurance and holding out and winning that way. But I think you'd be really hard pushed to find a coherent strategy on the US side.
I wanted to play a clip of President Trump speaking to reporters about US aims in negotiations.
No nuclear bomb, no nuclear weapon, not even close to it. Low key on the missiles. We want to see peace in the Middle East. We want the nuclear dust. We're going to want that. And I think we're going to get that. We've agreed to that. If this happens, it's a great start for Iran to build itself back. And it's everything that we want. And it's also great for Israel, and it's great for the other Middle Eastern countries.
So, Daniel Levy, you are a former Israeli negotiator under two Israeli prime ministers. If you can respond to what he's saying and also to what Iran is saying, that the idea that there's any negotiation going on is fake news intended to manipulate financial and oil markets and to escape the quagmire in which America and Israel are trapped, said the Speaker of Iran's parliament.
So there are a couple of things going on here, and I want to try and disentangle those. First of all, the question of are negotiations taking place? And what I think is very clear is that there are channels of communication via third countries. Those have been available all the time. Partly one has to understand that countries in the region who were not a party to launching this war, nor to the decision to go to war, who in fact cautioned against this war in the Gulf and elsewhere, they are feeling tremendous blowback and taking hits from this war, and they are keen to bring it to an end. There may be some who for some reason, still believe America can do the job and that they should trust America's competence and coherence in attempting to do so. I think most are not in that camp. They know that the cost is too high, and they are experiencing daily what it means to rely on America for your security, and the answer is not good. So there are a number of states, also beyond that. Turkey has been super active. Pakistan, for instance, Egypt, who are maintaining open channels with both parties and obviously sending messages because, by the way, the whole world is suffering from this. Higher fuel, food, fertilizer prices, etc. So there are active channels. Are they talking directly? I don't know. I doubt it, but I also think it doesn't matter very much. What matters is the question you kind of raised there, Amy, which is, are these talks, first of all, intended to produce an outcome? Was this another American deployment of diplomacy as a ruse? We saw in the lead up to this war that America played with negotiations, attempted that as a distraction, but actually intended to go for the military option. So is this trying to buy some time while the US waits for a third aircraft carrier, more of your taxpayer dollars, to be deployed in the West Asia, Middle East region? Was this a Monday morning pre-stock market intervention on the part of the president? Because if there's one thing he does pay attention to, it's that. So was he trying to calm the markets, give himself a few more days? Or is this a serious attempt to chart a path to de-escalation? If it is the latter, then that would have to include an acknowledgement that in negotiations, you have to listen to the other side. You have to take into account their interests. If you go in with maximalist positions, often designed by the worst elements of maximalism in your administration and by the Israelis, intentionally trying to make sure that talks cannot succeed, then guess what? The talks won't succeed. So if you think you can impose on Iran in these talks things that you couldn't achieve in your military assault, or things that they weren't willing to accept beforehand, then the talks are doomed to fail. The one thing that may be working to our benefit is not who might host these talks. It's certainly not the fact that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff might be involved, because that would be very bad news indeed, given their record of failure if they're the only people. But the one piece of good news is that the loose and perhaps non-existent relationship between what Trump says and the realities out there in the real world, that relationship means that Trump can claim what he likes, because what we're probably looking for is 3 victory speeches given in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Washington, D.C. They won't align, they won't match up, but they might allow for a cessation and then for some of these issues to be addressed afterwards. But as long as that doesn't happen, we still have to contend with the fact that Israel has been driving a lot of the escalatory logic in this war. It will continue to attempt to prevent a ceasefire. It's not alone. There are certainly American sources trying to do that as well. Israel is still on the impunity high from its Gaza genocide, which has led us here. And we have to contend with the fact that each time you try and get a mission accomplished victory image, you might escalate, leading to a further cycle of escalation, and then that can collapse any putative path out of this.
Daniel Levy, we only have about a minute left, but I wanted to ask you, while the war is continuing in Iran and Israeli forces are in Lebanon, the settlers in the West Bank continue to perpetuate violence against Palestinians, and the IDF continues to attack Palestinians in Gaza. I'm wondering your sense of how this has basically faded from the international view while the war against Iran continues.
Well, I wish I could say that it needed the war in Iran in order to shift attention away from this, in order for Israel to be able to continue to not be held accountable and to get away with these daily violations of international law and with these appalling atrocities against the Palestinians. But it didn't take the war. Israel is doing that, and it will continue to do that unless and until It is held to account, it is contained and deterred. And of course, you also see 1 million displaced in Lebanon, and the attempt apparently to re-establish a zone of Israeli domination there, still in control of territory in Syria as well. But I also want to challenge this notion that the problem in the West Bank is the settlers. There is no armed settler militia without the IDF. The settlers roam the West Bank with the active backing of Israel's military. Occasionally, they may call a handful of people to count and say, no, stop. But most of the occupation and the entrenchment of a matrix of control and an apartheid regime, that is run not by lone settlers. That is run by the Israeli state. That is run by the IDF. It is the IDF and the Israeli state that run that regime of control, that also, as you mentioned, despite the so-called ceasefire, are in control of about 60% directly of Gaza, are carrying out daily military assaults, daily killings of Palestinians in Gaza, still not allowing the necessary humanitarian assistance or shelter into Gaza, and in parallel conducting the largest military intervention in the West Bank, the largest displacement and destruction, often focused on refugee camps like Jenin, Tulkarm, Nur al-Shams, that we have seen since 1967. I think this will ultimately end very badly for Israel and generate tremendous blowback. But in the meantime, it is again the Palestinians bearing the brunt.
Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.